Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everybody. First and foremost, is the mic okay? Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope everybody's got a seat, has a bit of coffee and some food and is feeling comfortable. And of course, welcome to the TIGABATU Roundtable for Sociopolitical Exchange. Today's episode is in collaboration with the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute. I am Daniel Rahman from ASLI. Now, the TIGABATU Roundtable is a platform established since 2021, dedicated to addressing thematic issues of significant importance at community, regional, and international levels, aimed at fostering engagement and facilitate discussions among experts, stakeholders, and community leaders on issues of strategic geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geosocial importance. By geo there. Today's conversation is with the view of addressing a very current issue, which is the Iran-Israel conflict, or what you may call it. And we've titled it Temperature Rising, because when Rowena and I were discussing the topic with Helmi and Syed, we were also wondering a week later, maybe temperatures could have cooled down a bit. But fortunately or unfortunately, for purposes of this discussion, the temperature has actually gone up. And what we've seen in recent weeks has been, of course, the Israeli bombing of the Iranian embassy in Syria, followed by the Iranian self-defense, for those who may call it that, versus the retaliation in Israel. And just yesterday, in fact, the drones being shot down in Iranian territory, the origins of which are actually still unknown. Yeah, but we'll get to that more later. And of course, all of this is against the backdrop of what we see happening geopolitically. For instance, the Gaza, Palestine war, genocide. There are very many labels attached to this, and I'm also very mindful that in this discussion we want to try and be as objective as we can in the context, but also statements by our Prime Minister. So the Malaysian government has clearly taken a very serious stance on this and has come up with two statements, one in English and one in Malay, on the Prime Minister's various accounts. So what we see is a lot of interest, a lot of concern, and a lot of uncertainty. So the aim of today's session will be to unpack, peel the onion of this uncertainty. And I'm glad all of you are here with us for this discourse. And with that, allow me to introduce the speaker today and the discussant. To my left is none other than Dr. Rowena Abdul Razak. Dr. Rowena has a DPhil. Yes, give her a round of applause. She has a DPhil in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford, and is currently a lecturer at the Queen Mary University of London. Now, I know all of this is there, but for formalities, I'd like to remind everyone. Rowena specializes in modern and contemporary Iran, and while in Oxford, work centered on the early Cold War in Iran. Rowena has written extensively about the Iranian left, its oil politics, internationalism in Bahrain and Malaysian-Iranian relations. She has appeared on British and Malaysian media discussing issues related to the conflict, Iran and the Persian Gulf. Just yesterday, she was sitting by the side of an escalator for a BBC interview. Some of you may have seen the interview, but not the escalator. Rowena is also working on a first book project while starting that examines Iranian's historical and contemporary relationship with Malaysia. How bad is that? And Rowena has been observing Iran for many years. So again, join me a round of applause for Rowena. And Rowena will start with about 15-20 minutes. I'll invite her in just a moment. After which we will have our discussant with us today, none other than to my left also, Syed Nizamuddin Syed Qasim, who is a former diplomat based in Paris, with Wisma Putra. He holds a master's in diplomatic studies from the University of Oxford, is a part-time columnist and all-round nice guy. Nothing part-time about that. So without further ado, I hope everybody is feeling comfortable. And once the speaker and the discussant are done, we'll have a bit of a Q&A moderated, and then we'll open it to the floor. So feel free to take notes. With that, I invite Rowena to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was very kind and very good discussion, introduction. I thought for a moment, maybe you can give the talk and I'll just sit back and relax. Thank you to everyone for being here. I know it's Saturday afternoon, so I really appreciate your time. I'd like to thank ASLI as well for being a part of this, Liberal Latte for their space and for their encouragement and support, Helmi and Haja for, supporting me always, and Syed and Daniel for being here. And finally to all of you. I won't be able to look at all the angles of this conflict, but what I want to do is simply give a little bit of background of why this is happening now, a little bit of understanding of what Iran's thinking is, what is its policy, what is its long-term goals, and what does it want to achieve in the Middle East. It's important to try and restore some agency to Iran. It's not about Iran just being a target of Israeli attack and whatnot. It is its own powerhouse. It is a superpower in the Middle East, you could say. So I want to try and understand what does it want to achieve in the region and maybe beyond. The fact that the Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, has made some really strong statements, actually had a National Security Council to address this issue, indicates that whatever happens in the Middle East, whatever happens with Iran, has some impact in Malaysia. So I think that's why all of you are here today, to try and understand why this is happening, to try and understand how it's going to impact us. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, your comments. I'm sure all of you have some opinion on this matter, and also your questions. So today what I'm going to do, the three things I just want you to take away with at the end of the day. One is that Iran is a strategic, rational player in the Middle East. The Western media likes to present Iran as this irrational, belligerent power that, just wants to do whatever it likes. It doesn't really think it's a bad guy, right? And it wants to promote the narrative that Israel has the right to defend itself, and that the West should back Israel against even Iran. This is an inaccurate and very one-sided way of saying things. Iran is rational. It takes itself very seriously. It thinks very carefully, and it takes its time on making decisions. So that's one thing I want you to remember. The second thing I want you to think about, to take away with today, if anything else, is that what happens in Iran, like any other country, whatever happens domestically has an impact internationally. So the way it's acting today is very much because of what's happening domestically. I mean, some of you may be quite familiar with the protest movements that have been happening in Iran, the women like freedom protest movements, the demonstrations. So the government is using its legitimacy in some way. This conflict serves a wider purpose. So we need to try and understand the domestic international dynamic. Finally, we need to sort of understand the relationship of Palestine with Iran. The Palestinian issue has been a very strong issue for Iran for many, many years. Now, its recent attack on Israel has been seen as someone finally making a stand against Gaza, against Israel for Gaza. So Iran has gained a lot of political mileage for its attack among the Muslim world. It's seen as making a stand. It's seen as doing something that Arab states have not been able to do since. So this is an important, another takeaway to remember is the Iran-Palestine dynamic. Iran has had a very long-standing campaign for Palestine since the 1980s. So Mopalan Pact had understood, because its motivations for attacking Israel was not to alleviate the Gaza conflict. It was a bilateral conflict to a large extent. And these are the three things I'd like you to take away. So let's start with why now. Why is there an escalation of the war in Gaza? Now, not just the war in Gaza, why is there an escalation between Iran-Israeli tensions? Iran and Israeli tensions have been going on for many years. We've heard of Iranian scientists being assassinated by Israeli Mossad agents within Iran. We've had Iran, fighting Israel through its allies in the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. So this conflict isn't going on sometime. This is the first time we're seeing a direct attack on each other's countries, so on their own soil. It's surprising. I mean, it's shocking, but it's not surprising. It's scary when you think of missiles running from Iran to Israel, Israel to Iran, but it is not surprising. It's a build-up that's been happening for many, many years. And I think this is something we need to remember. It's not coming out of nowhere. So for the Israeli side, I mean, I think, Daniel, when we were having a conversation before the start of this talk, we were trying to think, what's Israel's motivation? The war in Gaza is not going well for Israel. I mean, it's going well in the sense that they're gaining ground, they're fighting, they're gaining land, they're killing, the genocide as we know it. But it's not going well for them. Netanyahu is still facing a lot of domestic opposition. In fact, it's gotten worse. There's a lot of more protests. A lot of people are angry with him for not dealing with the hostage situation. So a war is is useful. Iran is its sworn enemy. It's an easy target to use. The West, it's very easy because the West has also been fighting Iran for many years. It's seeing Iran as this part of the axis of power, the axis of evil. So it's an easy target. So starting a war with Iran is an easy way to gain some kind of ground and to distract us from the fact that things are not going well in Gaza. So that's one thing to remember. But what about Iran's motivations? This is a bit interesting because Iran, as I said, is a very interesting international player. It's very strategic. It's had a lot of foothold in the Middle East for many years. So the fact that Israel had attacked its embassy in Syria, it's not embassy, it's consulate, it's consulate in Syria, and killed a few of its generals and so on. This was seen as an active, very strong stand against Iran. But as I said, the war with Israel has been going on for some time. So for them to escalate the conflict by sending the missiles was a very clear stand to show Israel that it can do something about it. Motivations for the missiles are quite interesting. I think Iran set those missiles with full knowledge that those missiles would be shot down, not just by Israel, but by the US and its Arab allies in the States. For example, Jordan was also very active in fighting by shooting down those missiles. So that's something to bear in mind. So it was a very clear message to Israel that we can do something about you if we wish to. And similarly with Israel, sending missiles in, managing to actually hit targets in Iran, and not substantial targets nonetheless, no damage was really done. It was also a show of Israel being able to do something towards Iran if it chose to. So everyone's kind of showing their capabilities at this point. Iran is motivated partly because of its domestic situation. It's also facing a lot of lack of legitimacy at this point. There's been lots of protests. The government in Iran has had to face a lot of demonstrations and protest movements. So it feels that it needs to kind of hold its ground. Similarly, vis-a-vis its Arab neighbors, it's also had to show that it is going to do something about Israel because the Arab states, I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. The next thing I wanted to look at was Iran's power structure itself. A lot of us are very familiar with the Islamic Republic of Iran, but we may not necessarily understand its power structure per se. So I thought I'd go into a little bit of background to understand how it's built. We know it's an Islamic Republic, but a lot of us may not realize that it's a hybrid system. So even though you have an Islamic government, so sorry. Is anyone from Iran?
Yeah. It's not hackable, right?
It's fine. Okay. Is it safe? Okay. Okay. All right. So what was that? Iran's power structure. So it's a hybrid system. You have at the top of it the supreme leader Khamenei, and then you have the president at this moment Raisi, and just generally politics. Like in any other country, you do have elections. It's very much monitored elections, and the candidates are chosen by the guardians or the Islamic leaders themselves. But it's a hybrid system, which is quite interesting. So it's not an irrational, theocratic, extreme government. It actually has some balance and checks and balance to it. Ever since the 1979 revolution, with the coming of the Islamic Republic, you've had a struggle between more moderate forces and more conservative forces. So currently we are under the presidency of Raisi, and he is considered to be more conservative, more right-wing. And this you can see with what's happening domestically with the anti-hijab protests and the moral policing and so on and so forth. And internationally, you do see an increase of Iran's power projection and backing of its allies in the Middle East. And in terms of its military, and a lot of people may not know this, but the military is actually kind of divided into two. You have a conventional army, but you also have the IRGC, or the Islamic Republic Guardian Corps. So for those of you who may not know this, the IRGC is the revolutionary arm of the Islamic Republic. It was established to protect the revolution, and this goes beyond Iran's borders. It protects the revolution beyond Iran in the sense that it backs its allies, its proxies. So when 1979 happened, the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah. I promise you, this is not a history lesson. There's not going to be any kind of a test at the end of it, but it's just to give you some background so we understand how Iran is acting and why it's acting in the way it's acting. And the main names that we see in the news, especially if you read Western news, you'll see these names like IRGC, Iran, and so on and so forth. And I want us to gain an understanding of who these players are. So the IRGC, as I said, was established to protect the revolution and also, to some extent, export the revolution beyond Iran. And this is how Iran became involved in ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Its most famous ally is Hezbollah. I'm sure a lot of you may have been maybe familiar with Hezbollah. It's the Shiite party in Lebanon. It was established, way before the revolution, and Iran saw it as an important ally in the country, in the region. Iran, how it works is that it looks for Shiite allies, primarily Shiite allies in the region, and backs them. The plan to export the revolution ultimately failed. It was unable to actually export the revolution in the way that it wanted. So it dropped that idea very quickly. But what it did do was it kept its Shiite allies in the region. Because like any powerhouse, and Iran is a very powerful country. We may not realize it's a very powerful, very developed, very forward-looking country. And this is something we tend to forget when we look at Western media that paints Iran as this irrational, impossible country to work with. But like any superpower, like any powerhouse, it wants to have a foothold in a particular region that's close to them. So for them, the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. It wants to project its power. It wants to have influence. It wants to have gain in order to protect its interests and to protect its borders. Iran is vulnerable. It is a vulnerable country. It may be very big, but it did go to war with its neighbor throughout the 1980s. Iraq actually invaded Iran. When, on the other side, in Afghanistan, the Taliban government, since the early 1990s, has posed a threat, some kind of threat to Iran itself as well. So it's quite vulnerable. So it needs to have friendly neighbors, just like any other country. So we need to try and normalize why Iran is doing the way it is, why Iran is having these proxies or allies. And that's one thing to remember. The IRGC is part of that project. So the IRGC, it trains, it backs, it funds all of these Shiite allies in the region. And of course, in addition to Hezbollah, it also backs the Assad regime in Syria. So it also has the Syrian regime that it backs, Hamas as well, of course, famously, and the Houthis in Yemen. But one thing I want to point out is that these Iranian allies, they're not proxies. It's not like Iran is some kind of puppet master at the top, guiding these proxies in the way that it wants to. It actually allows for some distance. It actually allows for these allies to act independently. So a lot of the question was when October 7th happened, when Hamas, attacked Israel, a lot of the question was Iran behind this? This was a big question. And Iran said, we have nothing to do with it. And this is true. The allies, maybe they do things that are aligned with Iran, but Iran ultimately allows its allies and proxies to do what it feels it needs to do. So there is this independence, there is this distance that I think is important. And we need to restore agency to its allies and its proxies. It's not doing Iran's thing, it's doing what it wants to do, what it feels it needs to do. So I think that's also very important. So, sorry, not that the mic is so close to me, I can't really read my notes. So now let's think about the wider region. So now we understand Iran as a strategic player. It wants to wants to protect its borders. It has a security concerns and so on. So how does it fit into a region that is largely unfriendly? It's Arab, Sunni, or Wahhabi. It's largely hostile, quite anti-Iran, quite anti-Shia. So how does it fit into this neighborhood? We've got the Gulf states, so the Persian Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia, of course, is one of the biggest players, another superpower of the Middle East. And Iran and Saudi Arabia have a very interesting relationship. Both of them have been vying for power and influence in the region. Both of them have their own interests and proxies. I mean, to a large extent, it has caused a lot of instability in the region, of course, and Saudi Arabia under MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he's trying to move the kingdom forward. He's trying to project power even more. But it's difficult because he still has to deal with Iran being its main rival and ally, main rival. And then on the other side, you've got Turkey. Turkey, another big powerhouse of the Middle East, has also, and it's a very complex relationship with Iran. So on one hand, Iran relies on Turkey for economic stability. It's a big economic friend. Because Iran being under sanctions, it doesn't have many economic friends. It doesn't have many options, and it can't do business with just anyone. It has to be very careful with who it does business with, but it does rely on allies such as Turkey, China, and Russia. And Turkey as well has had quite a lot of anti-Iranian sentiments, but recently, quite interesting, Erdogan has actually come on the side of Iran with the conflict in Israel. So we're seeing a kind of bridging of its relationship with Turkey, which is quite, I think a Turkish-Iranian alliance could be something that might stabilize the conflict in the future, but we can discuss that if anyone's interested in that angle. And, most of the Gulf states follow Saudi Arabia, so UAE and Saudi Arabia, they try to normalize its relations with with Israel, in fact. And you've got flights going from the UAE to Israel, so you can see that the Arab states on the whole want to try and normalize its relationship with Israel. And this is part of a vision for a more stable Middle East. It's part of a vision to try and get more investment from the West and so on. Iran has stayed clear of that. And that normalization of its relations with Israel has actually made the relationship between the Arab states and Iran a little bit more tense as well. And again, this sort of ties back to what I was saying earlier about Palestine being a very important issue. And for a long time, the Arab states were on the side of Palestine. The Palestinians, they're Arab, and they're Muslim and Christian, but predominantly Muslim. So it's always seen as an issue that most of the Middle East was on board with. And for Iran, a very big part of its psyche, a very big part of its power projection is the liberation of Palestine. But the normalization of relations has made that very difficult. And now with the Gaza war, what's been very interesting, and not a lot of people know this because everyone's now concentrating on the fact that Iran has hit up Israel, is that at the start of the Gaza war, Iran was actually quite muted on its response to Gaza. In fact, Iran and Saudi Arabia met. They decided to kind of keep things be quite distant. So that's been quite an interesting something to remember and something to bear in mind. And then finally, we've got Qatar, another huge powerhouse in the region. It has a lot of ambitions, through many things. Like I can go into Qatar quite a lot, but I've been observing Qatar as well quite a lot since Al Jazeera and so on. So it's trying to establish itself, not only in the region, but globally. And Qatar and Iran, I know I said earlier that Iran is in a quite unfriendly neighborhood. Qatar and Iran actually have quite good relations. And this is also because Qatar and Saudi Arabia don't have good relations. There's a lot of tension between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They nearly went to war even at one point. And so you do see an alignment between Qatar and Iran. So the Persian Gulf itself is actually quite divided and quite unstable. Don't know how much I've spoken for, so a few more minutes?
I'd say about 2.5.
Okay, perfect. So I think I'll sort of wrap up with what does this mean for us in Malaysia and Middle East, Southeast Asia, this escalation of tensions between Iran and Israel. There's a political component, there's an economic component. So obviously, it goes without saying that in Iran-Israel, increase of Iranian-Israeli tensions is going to destabilize the region even more. We've seen the closure of airspace, we've seen shipping sort of slowing down. So it's going to destabilize, it's going to slow down economic exchanges between the Persian Gulf and this part of the world, the Persian Gulf and Europe. So a huge shipping area is going to be quite messy for a little while. And at the end of the day, with what's happened just yesterday with Israeli missiles going into Iran, everyone's going to look at what is Iran going to do next. Iran has promised that it will retaliate It said this a few days before the missiles actually came. They said that if Israel were to retaliate, they will return the favor, as it were. But I think the fact that Iran has been playing down the missiles, you see the news, you see Iranian news agencies, they've all been playing down the fact that that Israel or whoever, because it's not quite confirmed yet. Whoever sent these missiles, it hasn't affected Iran. Iran is unfazed. It showed, I remember pictures of everyday life in Isfahan. The nuclear agency said that its assets are completely fine. So Iran is playing it very cool at this point. But I do think that it is taking its time to figure out what it wants to do next. And on that note, I think I'll leave it to discuss it and the moderator. Thank you so much for your time and for listening.
Thank you. So my mic's gone. But thank you, Rowena, for that opening. We thought, unlike the normal Q&A, we wanted Rowena to set the stage. The mic's I think that's very important because Iran's not, well, for me, it's not particularly an area I'm too familiar with. And I think with that background, there's also a lot of new points that were raised. So from why is the escalation happening, to Iran's power structure, to the regional dynamics, whether it's Saudi, the Gulf states, Qatar, Palestine. I mean, Rowena, there's also, what about China and Russia? And what does this mean for us? But as the moderator, I'm glad I don't have to answer that. And for that, I would like to pass the floor to our discussant, Syed Nizam. Go ahead to share your thoughts on Rowena's opening statement.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Rowena. That was that's a good starting point where we gave it. Like I said before, whatever she said, So, right. Probably where I come in is we're going to talk about the role of diplomacy in situations like this. I know for a fact that when people say that when war or when conflicts happen or when temperatures begin to rise, people actually say that, well, you know what? I mean, diplomats are not needed here. That's exactly the opposite. That's why the diplomats are needed, because beyond the noise, beyond the saber rattling, there's always a back channel discussion happening amongst the key players that are interacting at the moment. We've heard about how the US was informed about Israel's attack, or rather counterattack towards Iran, and how they're playing dumb and all that. You need to realize that there's always two phases of diplomacy. One is the usual classical diplomacy, which is what happens behind closed doors. What is actually being discussed. For example, what's discussed, between Qatar and Hamas, for example, and Israel. They are all, they're negotiating with one another, but you don't see that in public. And most of the times it's because whatever things that you tell the public, it might not be received well. For example, Qatar negotiating with Israel, for example, that would not go down well with people in Qatar, and Israel giving, Israel green lighting, giving Qatar giving money to Hamas. That would not go down well with people in Israel, for that matter. So you have all these things happening behind the scene, and you need to realize that these are all approached because every countries, they have their own objectives to achieve. And going to Malaysia, you could see that you have the if you could recall, after 7th October, if you could recall well, at the time, we had a visit from the Prime Minister of Thailand to Malaysia. One of the things that they mentioned was asking Malaysia to discuss with Hamas to release the hostages captured by, Thai hostages captured by Hamas. Whether Malaysia has anything to do with it, I could not tell. But anyways, these are the things that happen behind the scene, and you don't actually say that, oh, I negotiated with Hamas. You can't do that, especially if you're from the United States. And this is where countries like Qatar and Malaysia actually comes into the picture. You have to become the middle person. And you could see how that conflict between the public face of diplomacy and the classical diplomacy, what things that happen behind the scene, comes to the front recently when, I can't remember the name of the senator who actually criticized Qatar for so-called being an enabler for Hamas. And Qatar actually took offense to that, and they said that, look, hang on, you know what, the United States actually wants us to talk with Hamas, so you don't say that to us. So, these are the things that things that happen behind the scene, and you can't actually bring everything to light. Which brings back to an early point raised by Daniel about statement issued by the Prime Minister. And again, I'm speaking here as a free agent, former diplomat, not working for his own portrait anymore. So anyways, so if you could actually look at the statements issued by the Prime Minister, basically, about the attack by Iran, Operation True Promise, you could see that that's a difference. That's the difference between the statement released in Bahasa Melayu and the statement released in English. Stark difference, and I'm quite surprised that none of the media actually picked that up and pointed that out. Because obviously, that statement in Bahasa is much more stronger, it's much more political, and it's addressed for domestic audiences. And the ones in English is for the international audience. And this is just conjecture. I mean, I have no evidence for it. Recent post by CIA, probably CIA said that, you know what, we understand you. That's why we're posting up posts on Nasi Lemak in CIA's Facebook profile. So anyway, that's beside the point, but that's the problem. I mean, that's the problem. One of the main challenges in modern diplomacy nowadays, you have two tracks, or rather, you have two phases of diplomacy: public diplomacy and the classical diplomacy. And Malaysia is pretty much, I think it's very efficient when it comes to its classical diplomatic approach. But when it comes to public diplomacy, there are many challenges. One is not just about addressing the different different divisions in society. For example, you want to address the domestic audiences, you give a different press statement to them. I mean, that might have worked better in the 80s, but not nowadays, I think. Beyond that, public diplomacy also needs to address people's worldview. Because, for example, when it comes to the escalation of tension between Iran and Israel, you could see among certain sections of the society, particularly among the Malay Muslim society, that, oh, you know what, this is all just wayang, because, you know, Shi'a and Zionists are two sides of the same coin. So you have to address that as well, because in modern policies nowadays, not just in foreign policy, even in local governments, you have to address conspiracy theories, and that needs to be addressed, because you might just laugh at it because these are just fringe theories and all that, but you see how that actually spurred up Donald Trump's QAnon movement and so on and so forth. It's taking a hold because no one is actually addressing them, because people just ignore them, swipe them under the carpets. But agencies such as Wisma Putra, the governments of Malaysia, need to address all of these. They have to counter all these narratives in order for them to actually explain their narratives better to the public. Because if not, if you just come up with just a bland statement without actually addressing the concerns of the people, that it's just going to fall flat. People are just going to ignore it as just another government statement that people just scroll through and without giving any thought about it. And people need to know as well. Like, for example, in Malaysia, there's this I would say that there are lots of, the sentiment is high, right, for Palestine, for Gaza, but people are not really aware of the nuances, the differences between the Palestinian authorities and Hamas, the conflict between PA and Hamas, for example. For example, we have the agency here, we have the ambassador of Palestine to Malaysia. Not many people in Malaysia are actually aware that who the ambassador is representing. He's representing the Palestinian Authority. It's not really the same government that is governing Gaza at the moment. So you see that there are lots of things happening here, and we are not particularly aware of the situation on the ground, but we just assume things based on sentiment. And the same, because most of the things we are informed through, for example, I don't blame them, but most of the times we inform through the media, which are not always nuanced. Much more to say about when you hear ceramah or khutbah. Fine, it's good for sentiments, but it doesn't really explain the situation on the ground, like what Rowena said. Qatar not in good terms with Saudi Arabia, for example, the UAE. Why exactly is the UAE agreeable towards the Abraham Accord, for example, Morocco, for example? What are the give and takes for these countries? And again, these countries, these are rational countries, and they act based on their national interests. Again, like what Rowena mentioned before this, Iran is also the same. In fact, having met Iranian diplomats, I would have to say that despite how they are portrayed, especially in the Western media, as fanatical, as people who couldn't really think beyond the dogma taught by the Ayatollahs and all that, it's far from that. These people are rational people. They know their interests, they know what to pursue, and they are not dogmatic when it comes to their pursuing their national interests. And I have to say this again. I'm drawing this based on my interactions with diplomats from all around the world. I would have to say that diplomats from Western countries are much more dogmatic than these diplomats from Middle Eastern countries. Why? Because they see the world in a black and white term: liberal countries against non-liberal countries, tyranny against democracy. So that actually affects how they see the world. Which is highly dogmatic, as opposed to people from Iran who actually say that the world is much more diverse than just liberal and non-liberal countries. There are nuances, there are shades of grey, black and blue, which needs to be addressed. But yeah,
I'll give you 1 minute to wrap up.
All right, sure. But then again, this is not properly addressed in the media. So I think going back to the point about how Iran projects itself and how the escalation of tension between Iran and Israel go forward, I would say that Iran is not looking, this is just a conjecture, but again, Iran is not looking towards escalating the present tension in the Middle East towards a regional war, because Iran understands its own capacity. Iran knows the extension of its capability. So I don't think that it's going to retaliate hugely. In fact, the attack against Israel was not really a real attack. It's more of a show of force, telling Israel that stop doing this to our consuls or embassies abroad, because we could do this to you. So because before this, there were many attacks on Iranian soils, Iranian scientists killed, so on and so forth. The generals were killed by Israel-US operations, but Iran never retaliated. This is the first time that Iran actually openly retaliated. And it's a clear sign that Iran said, enough, we could do this to you, and we're not going to escalate it further, but we could do something to you.
Right. Thank you, Mr.
Stephanie?
Okay. I'd like to open the floor straight away, in fact. I think many things were covered, and I thought if we can jump right into audience Q&As. While you think of your question and you can raise your hand, perhaps I will start a little bit first. So I was listening to an Al Jazeera interview on the way here where they were talking to Mohammad Marandi from the Iran University of Tehran. And very interesting, I don't know whether some of you watched this on social media. He was interviewed by Piers Morgan recently, he was on Al Jazeera, and he almost struck this, the Iranian attacked all drones by the Israelis, all drones by Israel. In fact, they were instigating Iranian opposition to send the drones. So it's actually unclear that where the drones came from. And remember, he even said that the size of Iran is so big, the size of France, UK, and Germany combined. Is it about that big? Yeah. Yeah.
It's a big country. Yeah.
It's a big country, and so, but interestingly, he was very almost dismissive. So to start off, Rowena, I'm just wondering, and even towards the end, you were saying that it's like Iran is playing it down. Is there something more to it? Is it almost like a reverse propaganda or something worse that may have happened?
No, I think it's quite. Thank you. Thank you, Syed, for a very interesting discussion. I was listening intently and taking notes, so thank you. That's a good question. Iran is playing down everything. I remember, as I said earlier, on the news channels, they were showing, I think there was a roundabout in Isfahan just showing traffic going on as normal. And so there was a deliberate, and I think there was even a statement recently by the government saying that there were not even any missiles. So at the moment, there's a lot of conflicting information and news items.
Why do you think that?
I think it's because Iran's trying to figure out what to do next. And I think that's partly why. So on one hand, I think they want to just play it down and sort of like let it pass. But Iran as a player is quite interesting. I think it's being very strategic. Iran is sometimes, in the past, it sometimes overplays its hand. Sometimes it gets too confident and then continues and escalates the conflict. And we saw this in the Iran-Iraq war. At one point, Iran was gaining the upper hand and it could have stopped the conflict, but instead it went into Iraqi territory. So this is where it overplayed its hand, because once it was in Iraqi territory, it was stuck. And then, the Iran-Iraq war was only, sorry to go back into history, but it's just to show Iran has this tendency to go a little bit too far. So I think in this case, with the war with Israel, it's trying not to do that. I think if it wanted, because now it's gone in, because Israeli weapons has gone into its territory, it could retaliate, it could start a war. And in order to do that, it would rile up public opinion, like what you want to do with the war. When you're about to start a conflict, you don't say things like, oh, business as usual, everything's normal. You want to bring up public opinion, right? And Iran is not doing that. And I think it's because they're weighing very carefully what it wants to do next. I think it's also going to see what Israel might do next, whether there's going to be more things or more attacks or not. But I think it's giving itself the option to de-escalate. We'll see.
Okay. Questions? Then at the back, Ken? Okay.
Hi, can you hear the...
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Rowena, and hi, thank you very much for your sharing. And Ken, I in Iran for 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, on religious intellectuals.
You should be sitting here then.
No,
Yeah. Come and join me, Ken.
not sure politics, but I just wanted was thinking of a few things I wanted to ask you and then get your thoughts on this. So one is the issue of transition. Because as you pointed out in the power structure of you have the Rafah, and then you have the Rabat, IRGC, and then you have many others. So they've been talking about this transition for a very long time. And I wonder what is the conversation on that transition now? Are there any conversations internally? And how will, and I'm asking this because how will this affect this situation at the moment? I remember, and I think you might remember as well when they shot the Ukrainian plane. Now, that was just a few days I bought the plane, like in that whole time in India. So very happening. But I think what relates to this because I think leadership and steady hands are very important. And recently I've read that Israel has tried to clear all the leaders on the ground and the second level leaders. So how will this impact the conflict in the future? Will the stability be there? Will it escalate out of control? The second question I wanted to ask is, so geopolitics and politics aside, are the religious figures still very influential in the decision making? How are the conservatives, the Islamic Council, how do they calculate it? And to what extent, in your opinion, besides geopolitical calculations, does religion and maybe culture play a big part as well? I remember when I was in Iran, also one of my friends told me it was very interesting. It shows a lot of Iranian culture is that that time Zarif was still the foreign minister. He was talking to John Kerry. So I don't know whether it's true or not, it's urban legend, but it was said that Zarif said to Kerry it never happened in Iranian. So that has always been sort of the slogan when you deal with Iran in Iran. It's never happened in Iranian. So I just wanted to get a thought on this and
All right. Should we take one more question first before we?
Sure.
And yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Hi everyone, I'm Amanda. I actually have a question, and please let me know if I'm clearly hearing you. So as far as you can see, Malaysia and Brunei are some of the ones that have stayed their stand firmly on the Iran-Israel conflict. And our Prime Minister has also stated that the conflict won't really affect our economy that much. So my question to the panelists, I'm sure Rowena or Nizamuddin factors into answer this, is that why does this put Malaysia? Would Malaysia be the top for countries to actually side with Iran in this situation? Thank you.
Right. And Amalina, go ahead.
Thank you for your questions. I think I'll tackle Ken's question. Thank you for both of your questions and observations were really interesting. So let's look at the first one about the internal transition that's happening. So for those of you who may not be aware, there's actually been a lot of talk about the IRGC sort of basically taking over and not the country, but just playing an even bigger role, linking it with the army and where its place really is. Because the IRGC is quite an interesting, as I mentioned earlier, it's quite an interesting arm of the government of the Islamic Republic. So I think that's still ongoing domestically at the moment. That's all kind of put on hold as the war in Israel is ongoing, but it continues to be very active internationally. And this is kind of tied in with your other question about the killing of its military leaders. So Israel has been hitting out its military, even the military leaders, even in the consulate in Syria, some of the military, I'm not sure they were actually generals, but definitely quite top military leaders were killed in that attack. And of course, the very famous killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Which was not just on Israel's side, but I think the US and other Western powers were actually involved in the assassination of Soleimani himself. So, but the fact that after Soleimani's death, and this is also kind of tied in with the other question about culture, because Shi'ism, it's a bit different from how we practice Islam in this country. They've got a lot of aspects which may seem a bit different, but from us, but it's very unique. So one of its cultural aspects is martyrdom. So this idea that you die in the service of Islam or your country and then you become almost like a saint. So if you go to Tehran, and has anyone ever been to Iran here, Tehran, besides Ken and you? Okay. Well, if you go to Tehran, you'll see lots of these soldiers, these murals of soldiers. It's kind of like shrine to soldiers. And these are soldiers that were killed in the Iran-Iraq war. So they're martyrs. And it's the same thing with these fallen military leaders, even the recent ones. They become martyred, they become heroes. I was talking to two friends of mine who were on holiday in Sabah or something. And you can actually buy t-shirts with Soleimani on it. So he's become martyred. He's become a hero. He's become this person who's fighting the West, fighting for Islam, kind of like a Che Guevara of Iran. That's what they wanted to do. So even though these military leaders have died, they still are able to have some influence even beyond death. So their deaths are used by the Islamic Republic to strengthen their position. So I think, so I've tried to sort of answer all three in one go. And I think culture plays a huge part in that. The ability to draw on martyrdom, the ability to draw on self-defense. Iran is a great civilization, so it has a lot of myths and legends. And even though the Islamic Republic doesn't want to be too aligned with pre-Islamic myths and legends, they hold a lot of water in Iran. So the deaths of its military leaders doesn't necessarily mean a lack of Iranian ability or Iranian. They're able to capitalize on that still. So I think I've tried to answer all three in one go. So I hope that helps.
And Syed, what do you think about the question about that Amalina posed? Would there be no effect on the economy? Actually, that's an interesting point, because if you look at the press releases that Syed alluded to, the one in English was only 4 paragraphs long, the one in Malay was 5. There's a paragraph missing from the English version. But of course, in today's day and age, all you need to do is take the press release, convert the paragraph, and you have it in English. And in that press release, the Prime Minister took pains or effort to assure the rakyat or the nation that the economic aspect or the impact will not be as great as many may make it out to be. Certainly.
Well, I think one thing for sure is that when it comes to numbers, traits, and figures, Malaysia is, or rather, the United States is a strong trading partner for Malaysia. When that's China, but still, the US has stronger presence than China so far. So when it comes to being vocal about Iran, there comes certain challenges. For example, in the past, like it's public knowledge that the US has been going all around the world, pressuring governments all around the world to shut down accounts or shut down businesses which are relevant to Iran. That may or may not include Malaysia, still bound by the OSA.
I think Malaysian students, Iranians are not allowed to open.
Yeah, Malaysian students are not allowed.
One of them. Oh, thank you.
Not allowed to open up bank accounts, and it's a constant demand by the Iranian students, like, please help us to open up a bank account. But because of that pressure by the United States, we don't actually allow, because of trade, because eventually Malaysia is a trading nation, and the US is a huge trading partner.
So the threat doesn't come directly from any unknown entity. It's really the Americans.
Yeah.
And kind of just want to add on a dimension here. You remember when the PM initially came out very strongly in support of Hamas,
yes,
closer to October 7, the Americans were proposing a law to sanction countries expressing support/sympathy for Hamas, right? And I think that was something that they wanted to raise in Congress. And many people, all these, I saw WhatsApps or commentators saying, "Oh, we have to be very careful. What has our government done? It has put us at risk of, potentially being trade sanctioned at a global level." What are your thoughts? How does this factor in? And Ro, feel free to chime in as well, please.
Sorry. How does this factor in? I think that's where there needs to be a certain balancing act on the government. Of course, you have certain stance. I think I could paraphrase what everyone said in his latest statement to his party members. One of which was Erdogan actually convinced his party members that there are certain actions done by the government which might not sound pro-Palestinian to you, but please bear in mind that what we are doing in the bigger picture is for the Palestinian cause. And I think the same thing applies to Malaysia as well. I mean, there are certain things that, there are certain give and take when it comes to diplomacy. Diplomacy is not about black and white. I mean, strategy is not about black and white. There are some battles that you just, rather lose so you would win the war. But the same goes with diplomacy. I mean, it's not about winning and losing, but there are certain things that you give up and certain things that you win. Certain pinpoints, there are certain strategic pressures that you could mount and you could ride on, and certain things that you could acquiesce to. So these are the things that, give and take between Malaysia and all these other powers. And you could see that, again.
As a diplomat, or former diplomat, as you like to say, is Malaysia doing enough?
I would say that,
yes or no?
Yes, but I think more could be done when it comes to public diplomacy, because it's not properly explained. It's fine. Media statements and all that, but more needs to be done in explaining to people what is happening, because otherwise people keep on questioning. People are wondering what is going on, what exactly are you doing? Because without that explanation, people are left in the dark. Like what you say, what's going on here? Is the US actually going to sanction us? What happens to our trade? What happens to my children who are studying there? People have lots of questions, so these questions need to be answered. But the answers would come in quickly. So people are left in the dark, just grasping for answers. So I think more needs to be done on that. Behind the scene, I feel like Malaysia is doing well, but more on public diplomacy, really.
Rowena?
I could just step in. I agree with what Syed is saying, but I think the global narrative is changing. That there's this concern of Malaysia being quite close to Hamas, being quite close to Iran, and all that. But with what's happening around the world, the boycott movement, the anti-Israel movement, it's global. The demonstrations, the protests, Hamas is no longer a dirty word.
Yes.
And I think this is something that's quite important to bear in mind, is that Malaysia is able to have this relationship with Hamas. It doesn't really care so much. It doesn't have to care what the US says, because in the court of public opinion, this demonization of Hamas doesn't really hold much water anymore. So I think that's something to bear in mind as well, is that yes, there's this concern of if Malaysia is too close to Iran, what would that mean for investment, Western investment, US investment? But I think that there is a shift in cause and in terms of value. We're not holding as much value on the West as we did before. I think that's what's quite interesting. There is a shift, and this is where countries like China and Russia come into play as well. So we're not just looking to the West anymore. And the public demonstrations is very much a part of that movement.
Okay. One and two over here. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Arif. I'm very engaging conversation.
So could you be slightly louder, Ari? Just a little louder.
Thank you for a very engaging conversation. Do you content from us? Well, my question is actually with regards to eschatology, the role of for example, the red hyper and the notion of material intervention. How much of it has an impact on the relations between Israel and Iran? That's the talk about Gaza as well, for example, of location. So is there like the role of eschatology, the dynamic that we not really kind of we don't really see in the media, right? So how much of it has an impact?
Thank you. Right. And over here, your question?
Hi everyone, my name is Elisa. I would like to ask a bit of a technical question, but I've heard rumors that Israel is using
questions based on rumors.
obviously, right? Israel, particularly Mossad, is using Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan. For those who are not familiar, the territory is up of Iran, currently the map. They're using that as a gateway to pass into and infiltrate Iran's system. How would that impact the relations, considering that right now, if we do who's next kind of action, will be Iran's attack back to Israel? That's the first question. The second question is on a bigger scale, because of ASEAN's division, looking at the bigger picture, considering that if this were to prolong, what should we do next? If you have any takes on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alisa and Arif. Just to add on Arif's point, I think earlier we were discussing slightly controversial point of is the Shiite movement a Jewish conspiracy, right? And I think that somewhat goes into that relationship that you may have mentioned. Rowena?
Okay. I think I'll look at the first two questions, and I'll leave the ASEAN one to Syed. You're welcome. Welcome. So, I mean, this is kind of tied in a little bit with what Ken asked, and I didn't really respond to, is that the role of religion in the Iran-Israel conflict. Iran is very clear. It is an anti-Zionist regime. With the exception of Ahmadinejad, with his crazy statements about the Holocaust, Iran on the whole is actually anti-Zionist. I mean, the largest Jewish population outside of Israel is in Iran, in the Middle East. So it has a very strong Orthodox position, Orthodox Jewish presence in the country. I mean, they are represented in parliament. So it's actually quite interesting, the Jewish population, the position of the Jewish population in Iran. And in fact, because of this conflict in Iran and Israel, you've had some Orthodox Jewish Iranians coming up in support of Iran. And so saying, Israel, we've got nothing to do with this, we're 100% back Iran, Israel's not our country, blah, blah, blah. So it's quite interesting to see that aspect in the current conflict. So let me just think the answer is quite short. Okay, it's very interesting that you brought up Azerbaijan and Armenia. Here's a little pop quiz for everybody. Can anyone say, where is the largest U.S. embassy in the world? The second largest U.S. embassy in the world. Which country is it based in? Anyone? So someone said something. Azerbaijan? No? Armenia. The second largest U.S. embassy in the world is based in Armenia. If you look at a map, Armenia is tiny, it's landlocked, and it is right above Iran. And the reason why they have such an embassy there is because it's in a very interesting neighborhood. We've got Iran in the south, we've got Iraq, we've got Afghanistan, and so on. So that's where the embassy is based. Whether Israel is using it, I mean, this is quite an interesting question because Israel is actually on the side of Azerbaijan in this conflict, and Iran is on the side of Armenia. So, to a large extent, Israeli presence is there. But they are still fighting through Azerbaijan and against Armenia. I don't think Iran is its target necessarily through that northern route. But it is interesting because so close to Iran, you do have Israeli presence just above and an Israeli ally. So I think it's a place to watch. In the case of this current conflict, I don't think they're using that route. I think it's actually quite sorry, my geography is terrible. I haven't done it since Form 3, so I think it's westwards, so it's westward, Israel to Iran, so it's more bilateral, but not through that. But I think it's still interesting that that presence is there.
On ASEAN, if this conflict becomes prolonged.
ASEAN, if the conflict becomes prolonged. Again, I think like you mentioned about how there won't be a singular statement, strong statement, particularly coming from ASEAN, because of the conflicted interest within amongst ASEAN members. But what you could generally expect coming out from ASEAN would be something generic, something that is just enough to capture the sentiment, but not enough to do anything. So basically like a statement of concern, yada yada, but you won't see anything that is rather instructive on how to move forward together as ASEAN in addressing this. But you would capture the essence there of how the region feels towards the prolonged conflict. It's more or less, I would say, similar but not quite approach to Sino-US tension. You come up with a statement, but the statement is, as one senior retired diplomat put it, it's neither here nor there. It's not going anywhere. But it's enough to capture the statement that you are uneasy with this position because that would actually affect you in the long run. So that is what one could generally expect from us then. I hope that answers the question.
So in 2 words, not much.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm putting it very bluntly, but of course it's very much more nuanced. I want to try to bring this a little bit to, we've seen George Galloway in Parliament stand up and point out blatantly how the condemnation by the British government does not mention the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria. And what we can also see is the Western democracies taking very firm position, pro-Israel position in that regard, on the pretext that it is the most democratic nation in the Middle East. How I want to position this question is like this. Perhaps they are doing that also because of the fear of what they kind of see as the values being espoused by Iran, right? Because if I were to be, let's say I play devil's advocate, Iran are not necessarily the nice guys here, right? Domestically, there are issues, imposition of certain Islamic practices, which even their own people are revolting against. Rising inflation, cost of living isn't great, etc., etc. So, what do y'all think then about the Western position really trying to emphasize the fact that they need to safeguard certain values and certain positions? Because mind you, let's say it flips, right? And then we go the opposite direction where, just for the sake of generalization, we become more conservative or more Islamic, not Islamist in that regard. Are we able to accept it?
This kind of world model.
Good question.
Thank you.
No, I was just thinking when you were talking about Iran's sort of domestic side of things, yes, forced hijab, for example, so on, repression, not much representation in politics and so on. Yes, but on the flip side, you look at the US and how Black Lives Matter, the anti-protesting right now in university students are being arrested for their support of Palestine and Gaza. This is a democratic country. It goes around telling other people how democracy needs to be. But what about its own borders? Does it look to itself? It's racism. It's, as I said, with Black Lives Matter, how Black people are treated, how ethnic minorities are treated. Yeah, if you look at the same thing, the US is still cancer. Maybe on the grand scale of who's more evil than the other. But the US is definitely on that. A lot of Western countries would be on that list. In Europe, with Islamophobia, you've got the opposite thing. In France, they're forcing people not to wear the hijab. Shouldn't it be a choice of women whether they want to wear it or not? So either enforcing it or not, or forcing you not to wear it is two sides of the same coin. You're policing women's bodies. Europe is doing it as much as Iran. This is just sort of playing the even more devil's advocate to you. So I think that's something that we need to sort of bear in mind. A lot of the standards that we blame or look at Iran is through a Western lens, not through the lens of its own, or an Islamic one or an Eastern one. Western values, you can't judge Iran based on Western values. It wouldn't work. Just as much as this is something that they tried to do before the revolution. They tried to modernize Iran under the Shah, and for those who, again, honestly, it's not a history lesson. But Iran tried to modernize, but they modernized on Western standards, and it failed. And that's why they had a revolution, because they did that by imposing Western methods of development, Western thinking on a primarily Eastern Islamic population. So obviously there was a clash.
Sorry. Just want to ask a few things. Ask for clarifications, really. It's a bit like what we discussed before about you talk about the forced secularization of Iran before the revolution, which eventually amalgamated with the revolution itself. So the children of this forced secularization, which eventually became the diaspora, the Persian diaspora, they eventually became the devil's advocate for the regime that is in Iran right now. So, how do you make of it? Because these people are the ones informing the Western government of what should be done in Iran.
Exactly. Like you said it exactly. You answered the question yourself. The diaspora, those who left Iran because they were pro-monarchy, or sometimes they were prosecuted. They were actually prosecuted in Iran because of their religious beliefs, because they were Baha'i or they were Christian or so on. So they left the country. And, obviously they have a very bitter, they've had very bitter experiences, and I'm not going to downplay that bitterness because it's valid. They actually had to leave Iran, their home country, under very poor circumstances. So, but then even within the diaspora, we're seeing, we can do a whole talk on the diaspora, because it's very fascinating. We're seeing a whole diversity appearing. It used to be this opinion that most of the diaspora is very anti-Islamic Republic, very anti-Iran, very pro-West, very pro-Israel. But that has diversified. In fact, the diaspora, a lot of the Iranians in the diaspora actually have been speaking out for Gaza. It's very unusual, because Palestine has always been seen as an Islamic Republic cause. Palestine was not always taken on by Iranians abroad. Because Iranians abroad felt that Palestine was too much an Islamic Republic issue. They don't want to be a part of the Islamic Republic, so they're not going to support Palestine, they're going to support Israel. So this was the kind of mentality of the diaspora. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically that's changed. So now we're seeing a lot of Iranians going to Gaza and actually being quite, I won't say pro-Islamic Republic, but they don't want to see Iran involved. Having said that, there are those in the diaspora who are saying that Israel should bomb Iran, because only then will there be any kind of regime change. So it's very complex, very nuanced, very difficult area. Yeah.
Let's take more questions from the floor. One in front and then at the back, please.
Okay, hi. I think this is the issues about the Iran and Israel conflict. In the diversion to the Gaza right now, because people are no longer kind of looking at Gaza and now for Iran conflict. So what is the impact towards this kind of thing? Is it just like you say, a wayang thing, or is something like we have to look into that further, and dissect this matter?
Yeah. So the question was, we also see the conflict in Gaza. Is this a diversion, a wayang kulit, as we say here? And what's the kind of bigger repercussions? And yourself, sir?
Thank you, Rowena, and Dr. You mentioned the RDC funds and support Hamas and Houthis and Hezbollah, but they don't actually directly control the activity that they do. The question I think that what evidence? So what evidence or anecdotes we have? They know the not the case. They don't actually have that.
Okay, interesting question. Earlier, we talked about the Islamic Revolution Guard Council supporting proxies abroad, but also said that these proxies tended to behave independently or autonomously. So the question is, what real proof is that of it, as opposed to some kind of coordination, potentially tacit? And of course, the question about the Gaza overspill and what this conflict actually means, whether it's a distraction or not.
Gosh. I think we are a bit distracted by the Iran-Israel conflict. So media has diverted its attention away from Gaza, but social media has actually been keeping the attention on Gaza. So the conflict in Gaza is going on. In fact, it's escalating. Maybe there was one day of no Israeli attacks on Gaza when missiles were going in from Iran. But the war in Gaza has continued, and Netanyahu just made a statement saying that we're preparing to build more settlements in Gaza. So as far as we're concerned, that's going to continue. But I have heard this idea that, oh, maybe it's a coordinated way to kind of distract everyone from what's happening. I think to some extent Israel might be glad for that, because they want to sort of rile up this idea of Iran being a malignant force. I'm sure maybe inside, would you agree with you on that?
Yeah.
Israel is quite enjoying the fact that we're not looking at Gaza.
Israel is, to a certain extent, some people actually commented that Israel is trying to turn people's attention away from Gaza by actually escalating it into a regional conflict. So when you have missiles coming in from Iran to Israel, pretty much Israel have the loci to say to the US, look, you need to keep on funding us because Iran is attacking us. So this is not just about Gaza. We are being attacked by a rogue regime. So basically, yeah, you're right. That's basically one of the techniques done by Israel, like pretty much to pull the region into a war in order for people's attention to be diverted away from Gaza.
And so how does this factor into the larger discussion about nationhood? So Israel just seems to want to change directions. Some of you may have seen the John Oliver skit where he actually deep dived into Israeli domestic politics and the lack of popularity of Netanyahu's government, whereby if Ben-Gvir does not continue his support, the government essentially falls. That may not necessarily mean a more liberal government, but it seems that what's happening now is almost, what's the term you use for when it's just a blank carte blanche, sort of all or nothing situation. Do you think that's going to happen? Because Qatar, earlier Rowena mentioned about Qatar being on close terms with Iran, but Qatar is also leading, or was leading, discussions for negotiations with Hamas. And if you look up the news just 3 days ago, Qatar said that because of narrow interests of the parties involved, they may just abandon the talks.
I think it's also, we've got to take into consideration the Palestinian side as well. I mean, but as Syed mentioned earlier, you've got Hamas, but you've also got the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
And this makes negotiations actually rather difficult, and hence the narrow challenge as well. And I think Iran might get a little bit distracted with this war with Israel, because if you want a solution, regional solution, you must have Iran, you must have Saudi Arabia, you must have all these players, and a lot of them are not going to necessarily see things on the same page. Saudi Arabia is, I think, it's got a bit of tunnel vision at the moment, from what I gather. The MBS wants to keep developing the country, wants to open to tourism, and you've seen all the changes, the adverts for tourism, and you've seen this. So he wants to develop and modernize Saudi Arabia very quickly. This war is a bit of this regional conflict is a bit of a distraction, but he is hell-bent on that. So he's quite tunnel vision in that sense.
Yeah. I know we're not talking about Saudi, but do you not feel that they can take a bigger role in this then?
I think they can do a bigger role. They can definitely play a bigger role, but they're not. And I think it's because of MBS's ambitions for Saudi Arabia to open up. They want to try and make sure that Western investment stays. They want to have kind of quick peace very quickly. I mean, to some extent, I mean, it tried to do something when it tried to normalize relations with Iran last year through, with the help of China. But with the war, I think it's keeping itself quite distant. It could do a lot more in Gaza, for example. It could play a much bigger role. Qatar is playing a bigger role than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has decided to, it's made some statements here and there, but it's not doing as much. And I'm not sure if, maybe Syed has more insight into this about behind the scenes and so on. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, there were some talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran about how to deal with this situation, but nothing's come out of it. That's quite interesting.
Sorry, I think we haven't answered for this question yet about the IRGC and the proxy.
Yes, whether there's any evidence for that. I mean, I think it's important to know that the IRGC it involves itself in conflicts that are already in existence. So when it involved itself in Lebanon and in the 1880s, there was a civil war going on. When it involves itself in Syria, there was a war going on. When it involved itself in Yemen, there was already a civil war going on there. So Iran doesn't create situations. It goes into situations that's already been created. So a lot of the players in the local organizations, they have their own needs and agendas. They want to really, so they want to, for example, in Lebanon, the Shiites wanted to gain some ground. I don't want to go into the Lebanese civil war too much, but they already have their own goals. Iran just helps them. Sometimes those goals are in alignment with what Iran wants. So, for example, hitting out at Israel, a lot of these proxies actually want the same thing. So you do see a conflation of interests on on Iran's part and on its allies' part. But we must bear in mind that the allies have their own agenda and goals because it's within an existing issue. If that makes sense.
Just want to ask, like, since we're talking about the IRGC, like, that's a train of thought that says that one of the main reasons, in fact, the main reason why it's difficult for Iran to have a proper cordial relationship with its neighbors like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, so on and so forth, is because of the existence of the IRGC. Would you care to comment on that?
I think with like the CIA,
Yeah, the CIA was steroids, really.
steroids. Right.
Yes, in uniform.
Yeah.
I think, the IRGC, they are known to be quite, as I said, this is an organization that was founded to safeguard the revolution, to safeguard Shi'ism to a large extent, and in a predominantly Sunni neighborhood.
Because the chapter actually says that it could operate outside of Iran.
It's meant to.
Yeah,
it's meant to because it was meant to export the revolution beyond its borders. They tried. I don't know if it prevents it. I think it's a two-way street. Iran, the Arab Gulf states also have a problem with Iran. They also, in Saudi Arabia, it's like, who do we hate more, Iran or Israel? It's either or.
Right. So that's really the framing in the view of the Gulf states.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I just don't want us to put the onus only on Iran
or Israel.
But we also need to understand the Arab Gulf states themselves as well.
Any more questions? Okay. Let's start maybe with Syed and then go down with your one. Yeah.
Hi, thank you all for really interesting discussion. I was wondering if you could tease out a little bit on the U.S. sort of dimension to this conversation, given their interest and presence in the region and this current conflict, but also tying it back to the domestic realities of the U.S. it being an election year. What the implications may be if after the election, there is for example, a Republican-led White House. And very much so, the same administration that had incredibly hostile stances, particularly towards Iran. And we're also seeing now, even in a democratically Biden administration, it's carte-blanche support for Israel. How would that look like for the region, particularly towards the end of the
Nice. I'll take you first.
My question is quite short.
Sure.
Correctly, you mentioned that the IRGC funded Hamas, but you did say that it's also protectionism in the region. Hamas is not Shia. What if they even funding Hamas then?
Hey, good one.
Right, so the question is pretty much related to her. Because I wanted to ask why to watch this
The fashion statement.
Fashion statement, right? Cool. So second question is basically, I think based on the number, Iran was giving up to 700 million to Hezbollah, and then they are training the Hezbollah operative back in Bekaa Valley and that kind of stuff. So, but then you were saying all these things about they are having a sort of autonomy, in the sense of Hezbollah to operate by themselves. So, I am trying to understand as well as her, how or what is actually the dealing between Iran and all these axes of evil and how they are operating, what is the dealing with them?
What is the deal with the
I wish I knew, to be honest. Let me look at the US dimension. Thank you for bringing it up. It's an election year, so Trump has made some really out there statements about Gaza, saying that he will sort it out quickly, and I think his son-in-law said he'll build holiday homes in Gaza. It's all a bit nuts.
Dennis Rodman. But it's
also, I think, his son-in-law as well.
Dennis Rodman in North Korea somehow became
oh gosh.
Never mind, sorry.
I can't keep up with the craziness that is the Trump family. But I think, if I was Iran, I'd use this opportunity to play my hand. I'd use this opportunity to negotiate. For example, Iran could very well say, we're not going to retaliate to Israel, but I want this. I want the nuclear deal to be back on the table. I want to reopen negotiations. I want my allies to gain ground, whatever. They could actually use this opportunity to do that, but they're not doing that precisely because it's an election year. They know that any kind of ground they get through negotiations is going to be lost by the time Trump comes to power.
Yeah.
So, just commenting from the Iran side of things, I don't know, do you want to comment anything on the US side of things? What they want to...
The US side of things?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the US is not in a position that it wants to be in a moment, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
It also, like Iran, it has its hands full, it has elections coming up. Like Biden, like many other politicians who submit themselves to democratic processes, he needs to appease to the domestic electorates. At the same time, he needs to do something that the US needs to do in order for it to maintain its, I would say, presence in the region. So, like when it comes to Iran, it's interesting to observe that the Biden administration, especially, it's not as down low as Trump, but I would say that it's putting more pressure on Iran as opposed to Trump. In a way, it tries to squeeze out Iran from its contacts all around the world. So you could see that happening from the policies that they regurgitate. That's what we refer to them. So that's how the US sees things. And Israel knows this. Israel knows that the US is really worried about Iran's posturing for power. And Israel also knows that, like what Ro mentioned earlier on, that the other Middle East and other Arab countries are not particularly happy with Iran, or not at all,
Not happy at all.
or even Turkey for that matter. That's a certain consternation there. But because Israel knows this, so that's where they are attacking Iran, hoping to drag Iran into this. But I think like what Ro also mentioned, like the response coming from Iran, it's a low-key response.
Yeah, it's relatively low-key. And I think Israel's response was also quite low-key. I mean, it could have sent more missiles if they wanted to.
So the point that the Prime Minister was quite dismissive.
Yeah, exactly. But
I think just to jump in on this, American general elections have generally been very low turnout, I think about 45-55%. This could be a year where you have even lower turnouts because the Democratic base would have been very jaded by the lack of response by Biden, especially with regards to Gaza. Not just lack of response, but outright hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Now, how the Iranian situation plays out, we don't quite know yet. Obviously, if Iran becomes more aggressive and America, has to somehow go to war with Israel or take a firmer stance, wars have always been very good for incumbent presidents. Hence, I also think that's part of the calculus for Iran. I don't think it may have a direct effect in that regard as compared to Gaza. But I think that everyone sort of also accepted the fact that the Republicans are going to make some gains this year around. And if you remember, it was Trump who tore up the Iran nuclear deal when he first took in the presidency.
And he also moved the capital to Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Iran, very difficult. I think, let me just answer the announcement of Hamas in Iran. Very good question, because, in terms of non-Shiite allies, Hamas stands out quite a bit. But, as I said, Iran has always seen Palestine as a very key issue for its foreign policy. Palestinian liberation is very important to the Islamic Republic. I mean, you have things like Palestine Day, you go to Tehran, there's a Palestine Square. So it's very much part of their foreign policy. So they want to liberate because they do not recognize Israel. Israel is seen as a usurper of Palestine and so on and so forth. So that's part of the motivation of funding Hamas. So it do two things. It supports the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it's able to use Hamas to fight Israel. The third was Hezbollah. And I suppose it's the same thing. So Hezbollah is not a creation of Iran. I think that's something that we need to remember. It's not a creation of Iran. But again, it's highly supported by Iran, but it's not a creation of Iran. It's a Shiite Arab and predominantly Arab organization. It's not Persian, it's not Iranian, it's Arab Shia. So that's something that also we need to bear in mind. And similarly, as I sort of mentioned earlier, Hezbollah was formed, in the midst of the Lebanese civil war. So it had its own agenda to try and protect the Shiites in the Lebanese population. And when Iran had its revolution, it wanted to export its Shiites, but not only just export, but also protect the Shiite populations in the Middle East, at least. And this was a part of that. So it continues to do so. It continues to do so. And Hezbollah has played a very big role politically. In 2006, when Israel invaded Lebanon, Hezbollah was the army that stopped the Israeli advance. They were the ones who fought Israel. Not the Lebanese army, it's Hezbollah. It's backed by Iran. So again, you see this conflation of interests of fighting Israel through its allies and with its allies. So it has, it is motivated by that.
I want to add something about like Arul mentioned about Iran and Palestinian issue and how Hamas is actually a Sunni political outfit and militant outfit. I mean, not just that. I mean, if you look back into history, one of Palestine's first embassy in the world is actually in Tehran. And what happened was that Khomeini actually took over Israel's embassy and passed it over to the Palestinian Authority at the time. And he had good relations with the Palestinian Liberation Front, PLF, headed by Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat, PLF, is pretty much secular.
And just because this is quite an interesting point, in the 1980s, when Iran was quite isolated, with the Iran-Iraq War, post-revolution, very extreme in many ways, the country that it looked to build its platform and to build its international standing was Malaysia. So this is the 1980s. Malaysia had quite a few Palestine conferences. So you saw, this is the time of Mahathir, Mahathir 1, as I think I'd like to call him, rather than Mahathir 2. So this is the time of Mahathir 1, very Look East policy, and Palestine was a huge issue. He basically made Palestine into a Muslim issue. As you rightly pointed out, it was quite primarily a secular, or the PLO, PLF were quite secular. But under sort of leadership of Iran and Malaysia, with these Palestine conferences, they made Palestine into an Islamic issue. They said, okay, as the Muslim world, how can we help Palestine? So this was actually built up in the 1980s. So as well.
And also the fact that we mentioned about like Mahathir 1.0 and Iran, our close relation with Iran vis-a-vis Palestine at the time. Not many people actually were in Malaysia that many of our view towards the situation in the Middle East, especially Palestine, is informed by how the Iranian authorities actually see them. One important artifact of that is the fact that Malaysians, especially during the last Ramadan, there are lots of people coming out in support of Al-Quds Day, which is on the last Friday of Ramadan. Al-Quds Day was initiated by Khomeini, and not many people actually know that. Like many people actually bash Shi'ism in Malaysia, but when it comes Al-Quds Day, like, you know what, let's go out and support Palestine. But that was actually started off by Khomeini in Iran, and many in Malaysia unknowingly support that, despite the fact that they're condemning Shi'ism. So it's complex. It's complicated.
All right. I'm mindful of time. Perhaps we go for another 10 minutes, then we wrap up. That's okay. It seems the audience seems quite. You're okay so far?
Yeah.
All right. Any further questions coming? 1, 2. So, gentlemen. Your name and then we can just.
I'm simple question is what you have seen right now. You're running a test. The new norms that we relationship region. So if this new law will start and now that law and give more land and power in the region. And by that, the balance of power in the region also will change in, let's say, and yes, but if this balance of power change, how relation, in a Muslim country, can perceive this? Because obviously, the balance of power in the legal thing, the foreign policy of Malaysia would also change with the Middle East. Yeah, and this will disrupt also the relation with Western power. Yes, I think, in my opinion, humble opinion, the Western power will feel that. And although it's going to be a multi-hour, we have here, but this Western power see that. So how relation will receive this? And the second question is both of the features is how the children how the world leaders see this change of power in the region, how they see these changes, especially the legal power who engage in the region.
Thank you. Hi, my name is I'm in Iranian. I don't know how many Iranians are here, but some of them don't know. I grew up in Malaysia past 20 years, so I would like to focus more on the Malaysia side than Iran and the other side. I want to look at the effect. I understand that fundamental of Malaysian foreign policy is non-alignment. But that's the biggest question always for me, because I always look at it from third-party perspective, that if that is a fundamental, why are we sometimes somehow I would say extremist to one point for one Muslim country, but not for the other? For example, how is it possible that they are very outspoken? Prime Minister was in Germany and he was saying that, oh, this is such a hypocrisy, you guys are closing eye, this is genocide. But then again, we can simply close one eye on Muslims in China, or what is happening in Muslims in Kashmir, for example, in India. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, because you believe that your foreign policy is non-alignment, which means I'm friendly with everyone, I'm looking for benefit, I'm not looking for trouble. But sometimes you just go beyond, which to me is a little bit, I would see that as a hypocrisy. I would see that. And I just want to know your view on that. By the way, my PhD thesis is on rivalry of Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I'm really working on basically Malaysia's foreign policy and how it's going to respond to the rivalry in the region.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask this question.
We can have you on the next show then.
Yeah, I think so.
Before that, thank you so much, Gerard.
I'm Gerard. My question is about Malaysia. Given Malaysia's historical stance on supporting Palestinian rights and the complexities within the Israel-Iran conflict and the disenfranchisement of the people of Gaza, how do you foresee these events influencing voter priorities? We go to vote again in 2028. That's not very far. For the life I live, it's going to be in a blink of an eye. It's going to happen very soon. How is this all going to play out in the next? How do you think it's all going to play out in the next election here in Malaysia?
Okay, wow, some very good questions from Amirul, Sahel, and Gerard. Let's start with the balance of power from Amirul, multipolarity.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Thank you, Amirul, for pointing that out. I think. And that's also how Malaysia will react to that new polarity.
Malaysia and the world leaders.
I think we're seeing the emergence of a new order in the Middle East. Yes, the Western powers are still going to be there. They're not going to go anywhere, but they're going to play less of a role. I mean, the fact that Iran and Israel are kind of acting on their own. I mean, the US has said, we're not going to back Israel. We're not going to do this. They've said many things. Whether they do something else, I'm not sure. But outwardly, they're not showing as much support for Israel, especially in the Gaza war. It's also asked for restraint against Iran. So you can see that, but at the same time, Israel is still doing things without US approval almost. So you can see that Israel is kind of acting on its own, on its own at the moment. Same with Iran. Iran is a power that doesn't really answer to anyone else. It has its allies, Russia and China. I know you mentioned Russia and China.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but after this.
Yeah, sorry we didn't get into it. But Russia and China, Iran's the biggest trading partner. Say Iran under sanctions, doesn't have many friends it can play with, so Russia and China are the two biggest countries it plays with. But it doesn't answer to them. And Iran, over the years, has been playing more and more of a role in the region through its alliances, through its proxies, through having strong stance against Saudi Arabia and so on. So it's creating sort of a core, not very good with analogies, but it's very good. It's creating its own power base very strongly.
If I can just jump in to really add on, I think the question also is the difference with China, at least, there's also economic power, right? And Russia, not so, Iran also geographically very far from us. Do you think it's still a bit of a wait and see, even if Iran grows in power or influence in that sense?
Yeah, and this is, and I think Malaysia has tried to position itself, and I think this is kind of tied in with your questions here, is that it's kind of tried to play all sides. It wants to be friends with everybody. Sometimes it does result in contradictory policies, and it's able to, and hypocritical policies as well, as you mentioned, it has such strong relations with China, and therefore it's quite silent about things like the Uyghurs, for example. But with Iran and Israel, it's able to make a very big stance, because we don't have any diplomatic relations with Israel.
And it's too far.
And it's
We
we have no cultural ties to Israel either. Here, we have cultural ties with China. It's different. So in Israel, it's very easy to have a very strong stance against Israel, calling it genocide, going to Germany, making these strong statements, because it doesn't affect us.
Both economic and geographic proximity affect the position.
Of course, and but just to sort of answer also Amirul's question as well, is that Malaysia is playing quite an interesting role, because it's aware of Iran's growing power, and it sees its alignment, and again, it's this conflation of interests, which seems to be a running theme of today's talk. It's in Malaysia's interest to also be against Israel and to have different economic partners. Even though Malaysia follows the sanctions, it's very aware that Iran is quite a economic powerhouse. It's a big petroleum producer of petrol, and we have bypassed sanctions in very creative ways. Okay, so I don't know if I'm not the expert on this, but I know that Malaysia does do business with Iran creatively, let's say.
Through other countries,
through use of different ships, international waters.
Change the flag in the middle of
the Pacific. So we do business with Iran, and maybe a bit of a grey economy area, but we do business with Iran.
They turn off the GPS like a ship.
Instead of the GPS on the ship.
They got lost. No one knows where they.
That's true.
It's like that, and we use that. So it's quite interesting. It's quite creative. And Iran, so Malaysia is basically positioning itself as someone who can also do business with the West, but can also do business with Iran.
Yeah.
And I think Iran is also accepting of that to some extent.
Because I think the concern about economic and trade is also, it goes down to the livelihoods of people, right? Businesses and economy. So that's something that then therefore affects domestic politics. So in the sort of, you have the diplomatic paradigm, then you have the economic paradigm. The economic paradigm more affects the domestic policy than perhaps even the political bit. But the posturing is nice, especially when there's a need to posture. But it reminds me of, when there was the height of the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar back in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of Malaysians went to the streets, protest, the usual after Salat Jumaat, trying to fight for the rights and demand that Myanmar aligns to more democratic norms in ASEAN. I remember announcements that we will now allow refugee children from these countries, of Rohingya refugee children, to get enrolled into schools and all that. But from a policy implementation perspective, there are a lot of problems. What I was made to understand is some schools who already had refugee children had to kick out refugees if they were not Rohingya, and can only take in Rohingya because that they will then avail to government support and funding. So you see, there's always the political posture and position, then there's also the policy implementation, which is a bit of a gap in that sense. Yeah. And Gerard's question, given Malaysia's historical stance on voter priority in the next coming Malaysian election?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on whether either side wants to use this into an issue, and they can if they wish to. Sort of anti-Israeli sentiments, use Iran, to turn Iran into this Muslim issue or stance, then maybe you can politicize and maybe even last it to 2028. It's still 3 years. But then if the conflict ends tomorrow, I don't know if that's going to keep the energy. I think we're, as people, we're like goldfish, right? If it's after a few minutes, we've forgotten. If it's not in our purview, we're going to forget about it. So, I don't know, it really depends.
I know time's almost up. I just want to ask very quickly about China and Russia. We haven't really spoken much about them. And as you mentioned, they are Iran's biggest trading partners because of the sanctions. And we've seen also that they are the ones who Iran has to count upon in the Security Council, right? What we saw recently about the Israeli representative calling out Iran for the attack, and then the China representative came out and basically said, but basically, bro, not cool. What are your thoughts on the role that China played? Because China is also more proximate to us from an economic and diplomatic standpoint. And how do you see this developing?
All right. China's playing a very careful game at the moment. It knows that the world wants to see what China is going to do. China is very hesitant, I would say, in putting its hands into the present conflict. Because China has a very practical, of course we say all foreign policies are practical, but China's practicality is that if it doesn't benefit me, or domestically, I won't even bother going there because it has no ideological affinity. It's not really that close to China, unlike the South China Sea, for example. Economically, fine. Tehran is more, more like a client state almost. Not really client state, but it's quite dependent on China. So China's position is really easier than the West. Going back to Amirul's question about multipolarity, because the West right now, and in fact this is not just a conjecture, but this is coming from the EU themselves saying that we need to maintain a Western-led order. So China is just riding the wave. It's like, you know what, we're not rushing to go for multipolarity, but we're just going to make sure that whatever happens next, we're not going to lose anything. So let's just wait and see where the US or the West is going to fumble, and then see how the wind goes, and then if things goes our way, then we'll give support to whatever things that we could give support to in the region. So that's China's calculation from if you look at the statements, they're quite in the statements and its positions and its funding. It has always been consistent in that sense. And the US, the EU has always been on the defensive lately. It's manifested in this trust book 10 years for the West. It's all about existential threat for the West, because for the Western countries, somehow there's this huge idea amongst the elites that if the world is not led by the West, then that is the end for the West. So they are still trying to grasp the idea of multipolarity, which is the opposite of what China and the rest of the world is actually looking at.
Well, basically the Cold War just never finished. And just listening to when one studies the Cold War, you'll see a lot of similarities with what happened, Russia, the Soviet Union and the US, kind of similar to what's happening now, maybe with the addition of China as another kind of power to bear in mind. So I wanted to comment a little bit about Russia.
Right.
Russia's obviously very busy in Ukraine, so it hasn't had much capacity to be terribly interested in what's happening in the Middle East. And as from what we've observed, they're keeping their hands sort of.
It helps them too, because it's
distracting Ukraine. Yeah, it's also distracting from Ukraine. So it has this quite happy effect that no one's really looking at what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. And the war in Ukraine is still obviously very much ongoing. Russia has been gaining some ground actually in Ukraine. So that's still really needs to be seen how it's going. Putin's had his election, and he's, as far as unless nature intervenes, he's not going anywhere anytime soon. Yeah. And for Iran, they're not beholden to Russia or China. Not really a client state. It depends on who you're asking. China would like to think Iran is its client state, but Iran definitely sees it as equal.
Equal civilizations, if I recall.
Equal civilizations, two great old civilizations. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that Iran wouldn't necessarily do things without Russia and China's tacit approval. And it does consult with Beijing and Moscow. I wouldn't say it doesn't. It doesn't do things just because it wants to do what it wants to. It does check in with Moscow and Beijing. It doesn't need approval, but it needs a kind of, it's okay that we're going to do this in the Middle East. And you must think of Russia, China, and Iran having spheres of interest. Russia, Eastern Europe, China, the South China Seas, and so on, and Iran, the Middle East. So in that sense, it kind of divided the world, the regions.
Works just nicely for them.
Very nicely for them. So, and they won't interfere in each other's regions. With the exception of China, when it wants to negotiate and help with the Riyadh-Tehran negotiations last year. So 2 years ago now. So, see, China can play quite an interesting role diplomatically in the region if it wants to. At the moment, as Syed rightly pointed out, they're being quite distant, they're being quite calm, they've got their own things going on. So, it remains to be seen whether they'll actually play a bigger role. But I think they can if they want to. Not Russia, but China.
Okay. Thank you, Ro. Any last burning questions from the audience? Are we good? I see some smiles. I think we are
Everyone's
okay.
tired.
All right. Yeah, I know. This has been marathon for you all too. Perhaps in the last 30 seconds or minute, if you could summarize your thoughts. What does the future hold? And I say this because in an interview just as I was coming here, you're speaking to Gideon Levy from Harrods newspaper, as well as Roxanne Farman from Cambridge University. And when posed to the question, will things actually escalate? Both of them said, probably not. I mean, they're both everyone's kind of just teasing each other, but very cognizant of the fact that what's worse could be worse for everyone. And you may actually see a petering off of the conflict. Now, what are your thoughts?
Firstly, there's no time for thank yous. Thank you to everyone.
Oh, there's time.
There's time, okay. And this is the million-dollar question. None of us have the crystal ball to figure it out because Iran has said that if Israel attacks, it will retaliate. But the fact that Iran is playing its cards very calmly now, saying that, nothing happened, we're fine, our facilities are all fine, indicates that they probably want to steer away from any kind of escalation. Having said that, whether Israel wants to do something remains to be seen, because I think it's seen that there was some benefit in attacking Iran, because it got the world's attention away from Gaza. It opened up a new conflict that Netanyahu can capitalize on. So I think it's still in their playbook that they still can go back to any kind of conflict with Iran if they wish to. 30 seconds up.
Can I repeat what we want to do?
No, that's all I want to say. Thank you.
I think for my take, I think what with all the constant images coming up in social media, like the burning desire to act on something or to support something, especially having seen the gruesome images and videos and so on. I think it's best for us, and I really love this quote by this French diplomat Talleyrand, surtout pas trop de zèle, which means above all, not too much zeal in whatever that you approach, because sometimes when you're too zealous, sometimes you suddenly figure out that hang on, this is not exactly what it seems like. For example, many people were quite quick to condemn the government about being close to Hamas, and that's exactly what Rose said, that things are changing. And if you recall back, organizations like the ANC, IRE, they had that change from being categorized as terrorist organizations to legitimate organizations. So we're pretty much perhaps a bit at the forefront when it comes to recognizing Hamas. But having said that, again, not to be too zealous when it comes to this kind of issues, because I know it's a burning issue, but always have a sense of perspective and look at things forward.
All right. Thank you, Syed. Join me in a round of applause for our speaker and session. Now, just a very quick audience poll. For many of you, how many of you think that the temperature will rise? Can I see a show of hands? Temperature rising. Okay. How many will say the temperature will not rise? Okay. How many days the temperature will stay where it is? Okay. On that note, again, thank you very much, Liberal Latte, for hosting TIGABATU, Helmi, Hajar, team round of applause for them. A gentle reminder that there is coffee available. And again, thanks to our speakers, Rowena and Syed. It's been a lot of questions, you're under the spotlight. And literally. And I hope all of you have gained a thing or two from today's discussion. You've been great. Thank you so much for the questions. And we look forward to seeing you next time, God willing.